As the Israeli occupation continues its brutal campaign in the West Bank, we witness a disturbing escalation in violence. The Israeli military has launched extensive raids across the region, killing dozens and forcing thousands from their homes. At the same time, Israel's plans to annex the West Bank are becoming increasingly apparent, raising fears that the region could face the same devastating fate as Gaza. Meanwhile, the Israeli Knesset is voting today on a bill that allows settlers to purchase land in the West Bank directly without going through the Israeli Army's civil administration, which is considered a step in the plan to annex the West Bank and impose Israeli sovereignty over it. With Israel tightening its grip on Palestinian land, we ask, what are the long-term implications of these actions for Palestinians in the West Bank? And how should the world respond to Israel's ongoing aggression? Welcome to In Depth. Fears are growing that the West Bank could face the same fate as Gaza in the face of growing Israeli aggression and the silence of the international community. The news outlet Al Ahram Online reported that many Palestinians believe that the ceasefire in Gaza will have far-reaching implications for the West Bank and Jerusalem. Amid the intensified aggression, Israeli occupation forces launched major assault targeting all the aspects of life in Jenin and its refugee camp, mirroring the devastation seen during the Gaza offensive. The news outlet added that Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has set conditions for staying in Netanyahu's coalition, including resuming military actions in Gaza, annexing parts of the region, and expanding settlements in the West Bank.
As the Gaza ceasefire takes effect, Israeli occupation forces violations continue to surge in the West Bank, raising fears of a broader escalation. During the Israel's recent Iron Wall military operation in Jenin, a widespread assault targeted the city and its refugee camp, mirroring the devastation seen in Gaza. Palestinian Authority officials view these actions as an attempt to salvage the Israeli government's domestic standing and maintain coalition unity, which was strained after the Otzma Yehudit party withdrew following the Gaza ceasefire. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich further demanded expanded settlements and military operations in the North and West Bank, raising concerns of further escalation. Meanwhile, the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned that Israel might seize the opportunity to annex the occupied West Bank. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Guterres said, "There is a risk that Israel will feel this is the moment to annex the West Bank and keep the Gaza Strip in a state of limbo." Additionally, UN experts expressed concern over Israel's ongoing attacks in the occupied West Bank, warning that the intensified campaign marks a dangerous escalation against Palestinians. They noted that bombing Jenin, destroying vital infrastructure and essential services such as water and electricity, and raiding hundreds of homes are only aggravating a deeply unstable situation in the West Bank. After almost a week of Israeli occupation forces shifting their violence toward the West Bank, will the West Bank face the same fate as Gaza?
And for more analysis, we're joined from Jenin by Mr. Samir Abahra, political analyst, and from Cairo by Dr. Muhammad Osman, international relations specialist. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. And I would start with Mr. Abahra. The recent killing stir of Palestinians in the West Bank highlights the growing violence. How do you assess the escalation of this violence, particularly in the wake of the war on Gaza?
Good evening to you and your dear guest. Yes, the events in Gaza and the West Bank are interlinked. It is the same cause. During the events in Gaza and during the war in Gaza, like 800 martyrs fell in the West Bank as the Israeli forces never left the West Bank even during the war in Gaza, and the intensifying the bombing in the West Bank is completely linked to the agreement between Hamas and Israel for the exchange of hostages and the ceasefire. The result of this agreement was a conflict within the Israeli government, which led to the resignation of Ben Gvir and the threatening of Smotrich to tender his resignation, who remained in the government under certain conditions to continue the war after phase 1 of the agreement. In addition, that there were conditions to annex the West Bank. Netanyahu tried to satisfy the war wing, especially after the pressure Smotrich practiced after his statement to establish more settlements in the West Bank, and then the Israeli forces increased their presence in the West Bank. So far, Israeli officials are saying that the war in the West Bank and Jenin is now a war of targets and objectives. There are Israeli objectives to be achieved in the West Bank and especially in Jenin. The main goal here in Jenin, as indicated by the Israelis, that they need to cut the Iranian arms in the camp, especially the Jenin camp residents. What happened in Jenin, the complete evacuation and displacement of the Jenin camp, it is now an empty camp, destroying streets and the buildings in the camp.
Mr. Abahra, I would like to elaborate on this point in a far extensive way, but I will go now to Dr. Osman to ask you, sir, about the Israeli Knesset, which will vote on a bill allowing settlers to purchase land in the West Bank directly, bypassing the Israeli military civil administration. Now, how do you view this move in terms of Israel's broader plans to annex the West Bank?
Thank you for having me, Hala. I think this comes in a coordinated, sustained effort in order to completely abort any possibility of a two-state solution to the Palestinian cause in the foreseeable future, and even maybe in the future in its very absolute terms. Now this far-right government of Benjamin Netanyahu, supported and backed by a U.S. administration led by Donald Trump, that completely disregards the common sensibilities of and the foundational principles of settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think we should not be surprised now that the Israeli government and the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is trying to facilitate the purchase of occupied land, illegally occupied land, I would say, by Israeli settlers, meaning that all the guardrails that were set in place in order to coordinate and even contain the settlement movement in the past, I think these checks and balances are not there anymore. Now the expansion of settlements will rather move haphazardly and at a much more accelerated pace in order to create new realities on the ground in the West Bank. About 600,000 Israeli settlers already are illegally occupying about 25 to 30% of the West Bank. And there are plans, there are rumors that Israel intends to annex these settlements to Israel proper, and maybe even the United States, led by Donald Trump, might recognize these illegal annexations, which will include the surroundings of East Jerusalem. So I think we are on the precipice of a very dangerous escalation in the occupied territories. We are on the verge of creating new realities. We have seen the genocide in the Gaza Strip, turning Gaza into an uninhabitable land, and now there are attempts to displace the people of Gaza and relocate them elsewhere. And the only thing standing in the way is Egypt's resilience. The same could be said about the West Bank. At some point, Jordan opposes these plans or propositions of displacement. So as you can see, Hannah, I think that we are moving further away from the two-state solution with such measures that have been taken, like the one taken by the Knesset today.
Yes, which brings me back to the point where we stopped, Mr. Abahra, when we were talking about how Israeli forces continue to demolish homes and raid civilian areas in the West Bank, suggesting that this could be part of a larger plan to annex the West Bank. The question here, what would this mean for the Palestinian residents there?
Yes, around 60 houses in the Jenin camp were completely demolished, in addition to destruction of streets and destruction of infrastructure in the camp and in the city, as well as a number of martyrs killed and injured. A complete war on the city of Jenin, with the excuse of targeting Iranian targets, and also evacuating the Jenin camp residents. Now it is fully evacuated except for some persons with disabilities who are from the elderly. Moving from now other neighborhoods in Jenin, there is an extended mission by the Israeli army to evacuate the rest of the neighborhoods and to comment on the annexation plan. This is a Smotrich plan to annex the West Bank and to establish the settlements, in addition to a decision especially made by the Israeli government to annex the eastern areas, such as the Al-War region, which is a quarter of the West Bank area, in addition to the 42% of the area which are actually established settlement already. Now they're moving towards Jordan. These are the Iranian prisons are excuses made by the Israeli forces to annex more lands of the West Bank. If we add 25% to the already established 42%, what is left of the West Bank for the Palestinians? This is a question that the international community should answer. These Israeli crimes and violations committed in the West Bank and Jenin, and we are faced by silence from the international community, from the US administration, which is controlling the politics of the world. It is the complete supporter of these Israeli aggressions. They have a green light by the Trump complete scheme for the Middle East. They are the Israelis are receiving complete support and help from the US to end any project for the establishment of the Palestinian state, leaving Palestinians suffering in their homelands.
Dr. Osman, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz vowed that Israeli occupation forces will remain in Jenin refugee camp, saying that Jenin, he made a very strange statement, will not return to be what it was. I see it as a very alarming statement, but how do you view his statements in light of Israel's broader strategy of annexing the West Bank?
Well, Hala, I would concur entirely with your assessment, of course. This is a very alarming statement, and it does signify and indicate what Israel intends. And we are seeing that on the ground. These are not just empty words uttered by the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz. We are seeing
into
this
action.
on the ground. Yes. They are demolishing entire quarters of the Jenin refugee camp. They have displaced the vast majority of its population. More than 10,000 people have been displaced from the refugee camp. Medical facilities and hospitals have been targeted and vandalized. Ambulances have been destroyed. Roads have been vandalized. We are seeing trends of military operations, that subversive military operations that we have seen in the Gaza Strip. So we are seeing a miniature version of what happened in Gaza in Jenin, and it might be something that might be extended to other areas of the West Bank in the very near future, in order to uproot not only resistance movements in the West Bank, but also parts of the population. We are seeing that in Tulkarm, for example, military operations did take place, and hundreds of people were forced out of their homes in Tulkarm over the past 48 hours. So we are seeing a rising trend, an escalating trend of increased violence in the West Bank by the Israeli army of the occupation, and by the Israeli security forces, and by Israeli armed settlers as well. So this is a very, very, very dangerous development, and it comes in line with the grander designs of attempting to annex the West Bank. If you see where Jenin is, even though Jenin is supposedly in the area which is the 11% Area A, which is under the jurisdiction and the control of the Palestinian Authority, yet it has been invaded and basically besieged by the Israeli army, the city of Jenin, and it's very close to the border, to the northern borders between the West Bank, Palestine, and the internationally recognized borders of Israel. So maybe the expulsion of the population of Jenin, and maybe even the emptying of Jenin, might be part of larger designs in order to create, to expand the borders of Israel and remove Palestinian population centers away from the borders and the settlements and the cities of the state of Israel. We are seeing ethnic cleansing in motion in the West Bank, just on a much lesser scale, and it might expand and escalate in the coming days and months and weeks if the Trump administration greenlights it.
Exactly.
Netanyahu is more than ready.
Yes. Back to you again, Mr. Abahara, since you're joining us from Jenin, and since we're talking about Israel's continued expansion of settlements and the violent tactics in the West Bank, do you fear that the area could face a similar fate to Gaza, where Palestinians are displaced and their land is annexed?
With the settlement process, there are pressure by the settlers on the Israeli government to intensify the settlement activity. Trump now has lifted sanctions on the settlers who are now practicing all kinds of aggressions and hostilities on the populations in the West Bank. The Smotrich's scheme to establish new settlements in the West Bank is now in place. These are the desires of the far wing in Israel that does not acknowledge the presence of Israeli people or the Palestinian West Bank. Now we hear the U.S. officials' statements that there is no such thing as the West Bank. It is part of Israel, and there are rights for Israel in this region. Also, the representative of the U.S. in the Security Council stated the same today, that the Jewish state has a right in the West Bank. Now the West Bank term is not commonly used by the politicians supporting Israel, which is giving green light for the settlers to take more areas of the West Bank. Now there is no geographic connection between the populations in the West Bank cities. As there is no connections or communication between one city to another, which is happening and taking place right now in the West Bank. It is very difficult to move from one city or from one governance to another. It might take like a 5 or 6 hour walk to move from one place to another.
Mr. Osman, the international community often condemns the actions of the IOF in Gaza. This is its reaction, but there seems to be less focus on the West Bank. You have just heard Mr. Abahar saying that politicians rarely use the term West Bank. So from an international law perspective, what legal measures can be taken to hold Israel accountable for its actions in the occupied territories?
The occupied territories of Palestine, per the membership of the State of Palestine, which is internationally recognized by 140 countries, it is a member of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And the ICC did rule in 2021 that they do have jurisdiction inside the occupied Palestinian territories per Palestine's membership of the ICC. And they were actually, before the Gaza genocide, they were investigating the illegal settlements and the expansion of settlements inside the occupied Palestinian territories. This comes in complete violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention clearly states, the fourth one, that occupying powers may not, under any circumstances, move their populations or their own citizens, whether temporarily or permanently, to settle in the areas or the country they occupy. This is exactly what Israel is doing. So that means that in accordance with the Geneva Convention, which is basically the laws of war, this is a war crime. So what the Israelis are doing in this regards, they can be prosecuted. The Israeli officials and the Israeli settlers can be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, for example. And also the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinions, did say that the West Bank is an occupied territory. Therefore, Israel has no legal standing whatsoever when it comes to, or legal grounds whatsoever when it comes to expanding or building settlements inside the West Bank. However, unfortunately, Hala, all of this does not matter. Everything depends on the political will of the powerful. And who is the powerful actor that is willing to... Exactly. You answered it, and you got it off the top. The United States. So the United States will continue to enforce Israel's impunity. The United States previously imposed sanctions on the ICC and is even planning on imposing more sanctions on the ICC due to their stance, to their arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and former the Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, just because they said that they will investigate them on grounds that they are war criminals, which they are. So you can imagine how toothless international organs are in front before the impunity of Israel. And the United States is, and from behind it, many Western countries are disregarding and basically emptying international law and international institutions from any integrity or credibility by going on such a trajectory, which means that the world will be a much less safer place because chaos will consume. Whoever will have the power will do whatever he wants. We are seeing that in Ukraine. We will see that in many other parts of the world, maybe soon. And definitely we are seeing that in Palestine with the impunity and the criminal behavior of the state of Israel, whether on the West Bank, in the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip, or even beyond in Syria and Lebanon.
Now I will go back again to Mr. Abahar, but briefly I want to ask you about the rise in settler violence in the West Bank since the start of the war on Gaza. How do you view the Israeli government's response to these acts? Are they encouraging that one way or another?
The Israeli government, of course, is giving the green light to settlers. They are committing all kinds of violence right in front of the Israeli army troops. They are there to protect the settlers, not to prevent any kinds of hostilities. They provide complete protection to the settlers. under the Biden administration, he imposed the sanctions and restrictions on the settlers. But once these sanctions or restrictions were lifted, they are now stronger than ever, besieging main streets and regions within the West Bank, destroying cars and beating up citizens. All kinds of actions and activities that tamper with the security and peace, without any actions or reactions from the Israeli troops that are there to just only to protect them.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Samir Abahra, political analyst from Jenin, and Dr. Muhammad Osman, international relations specialist, joining us from Cairo. Thank you for your insights. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.